I watched through my kitchen window as three matching white Ford F350s, each hauling a loaded grain trailer, rolled out of my driveway at 6 in the morning, and my stomach dropped when I saw the HOA tow trucks following behind them with their yellow lights flashing. The trucks weren't broken down. They weren't illegally parked. They were ready to haul 200 acres worth of wheat to the grain elevator in Salina, Kansas, before the storm system rolled in that afternoon. But apparently, Barbara Hendricks had other plans for my harvest season. My name is Lucas Peterson, and I had been farming the land surrounding Meadowbrook estates for 3 generations before some developer bought the adjacent property and turned it into a subdivision with strict covenants and an HOA that thought they ran the entire county. My farmhouse sat on 5 acres that technically fell within their boundaries due to some annexation nonsense from 5 years back, but I had always kept to myself, paid my dues when I remembered, and figured they would leave a working farm alone. I figured wrong. I ran out the front door in my work boots and jeans, still pulling on a shirt, and sprinted toward the road where the convoy had stopped. My farm manager, Miguel, was already there arguing with a guy in a polo shirt holding a clipboard. "What the hell is going on?" I shouted as I reached them. The polo shirt guy turned to me with the kind of smile that made me want to punch something. "Mr. Peterson? I am Derek Simmons from Titan Towing. We have been contracted by the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association to impound these vehicles until outstanding dues and fines are paid in full. Those are commercial farming vehicles actively being used for harvest. You cannot just take them." Derek consulted his clipboard. According to the HOA bylaws, any resident with outstanding debts to the association is subject to property liens and asset seizure after proper notification. You were sent 3 certified letters. I felt my face getting hot. I never got any certified letters, and even if I did, you cannot take equipment that is essential to someone's livelihood. That is not how any of this works. The HOA has filed the appropriate liens with Riley County. Everything is legal. Derek gestured to the tow truck drivers, who were already positioning their vehicles. "The trucks and trailers will be stored at our facility until you settle your account. The amount owed is $8,473. $8,000? I stared at him. "My annual dues are $1,200. What are you talking about?" "Accumulated late fees, violation fines, and legal processing costs." Derek held out a sheet of paper. "It is all itemized here." I grabbed the paper and scanned it quickly. Late fees of $50 per month going back 3 years. Violation fines for everything from unapproved agricultural equipment visible from the street to commercial vehicle parking to failure to maintain approved landscaping standards. It was insane. Every single line item was something related to running an actual working farm. Miguel stepped up beside me. "Lucas, we need those trucks today. The wheat has been tested and is ready. If we do not get it to the elevator before the rain, we are looking at quality downgrades or total loss." "I know," I turned back to Derek. "Look, I can write you a check right now for the actual dues I owe, but these fines are garbage, and you know it. I am going to fight every single one." "That is your right," Derek said cheerfully, "but the vehicles stay impounded until the full amount is paid. You can appeal the fines through the HOA board at their next meeting." "When is that?" 2 weeks from Thursday." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. 2 weeks? My entire wheat crop will be ruined by then. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses. Derek shrugged. "Take it up with the HOA. I just tow what I'm told to tow." I watched helplessly as they hooked up my trucks one by one. Each truck represented a $100,000 investment, and each trailer was loaded with wheat worth roughly $30,000. The grain had been harvested at optimal moisture content, stored properly, and was ready for delivery. But wheat is a living thing, even after it is cut. Leave it sitting in a trailer through summer heat and thunderstorms, and it starts to degrade. Moisture levels rise, mold develops, and the grade drops from premium to feed quality or worse. Miguel stood beside me as the last truck was towed away. "What do we do?" "Get on the phone with every rental company within 200 miles. See if anyone has heavy-duty trucks available. I will call the elevator and explain the situation." But 3 hours later, we had nothing. It was peak harvest season, and every available truck was already rented. The grain elevator told me they could hold my delivery slot for 24 hours, but after that, I would have to reschedule for next week at the earliest. I explained that the wheat could not wait that long, but the dispatcher just sighed and said there was nothing he could do. I spent the rest of the morning calling lawyers. The first two told me that HOA impoundment cases were complicated and would take weeks to resolve through the courts. The third lawyer, a guy named Richard Chen in Manhattan, Kansas, told me something more useful. They are going to argue that the trucks are personal property subject to the HOA lien, Richard explained. But commercial farming equipment used in an active business operation has different protections under Kansas law. The problem is getting in front of a judge fast enough to matter. Can you file an emergency injunction? I can try, but even emergency hearings take a few days to schedule, and the judge might not see it as a true emergency from a legal standpoint. $250,000 in crops is going to rot. How is that not an emergency? I'm on your side, Mr. Peterson. I'm just telling you what we are up against. I hung up and stared at the wall. My grandfather had built this farm from nothing. My father had expanded it and modernized it. I had spent the last 15 years paying off equipment loans and building relationships with seed suppliers and grain elevators and crop insurance companies. One bad harvest could set me back years. A total loss could end everything. That afternoon, I drove to the Meadowbrook Estates HOA office, which was located in a strip mall next to a nail salon and a Subway. The office was small and aggressively beige, with motivational posters on the walls and a reception desk staffed by a college-age kid who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. I need to speak with Barbara Hendricks, I said. The kid glanced at his computer. Do you have an appointment? No, but she just impounded $200,000 worth of my property, so I think she can spare 5 minutes. He hesitated, then picked up the phone and mumbled something. A moment later, a door opened, and Barbara Hendricks walked out. Barbara was exactly what you would picture when someone says HOA president. Mid-50s, aggressively styled blonde hair, pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, and an expression like she smelled something unpleasant. I had seen her around the neighborhood before, usually yelling at someone about their mailbox or their grass height. Mr. Peterson, she said, not offering to shake hands. I assume you are here about your vehicles. You assume correctly. What you did this morning was illegal, and you are going to cost me $250,000 if you do not release those trucks immediately. Barbara smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. Everything we did was completely legal. You received multiple notifications about your outstanding balance. You ignored them. The HOA has the right to enforce collections through property liens. I never received any notifications, and even if I did, you cannot just steal someone's business equipment. We did not steal anything. We exercised our legal right to secure assets equal to the debt owed. If you pay your bill, you get your trucks back. It is very simple. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Barbara, listen to me. Those trucks are loaded with wheat that needs to be delivered today. If it sits for more than a few days, especially with the weather coming in, it will be ruined. I'm not exaggerating. We are talking about total crop loss. Perhaps you should have thought about that before ignoring your HOA obligations. The obligations are bullshit. You are charging me fines for running a farm that has been here for 70 years, long before your HOA even existed. Barbara's expression hardened. When you purchased your property, you agreed to abide by the Meadowbrook Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions. That includes all residents within the HOA boundaries. The fact that you run a farm is irrelevant. Rules are rules. My grandfather homesteaded this land in 1952. I did not purchase anything. And your HOA annexed my property without my consent 5 years ago through some backdoor county commission vote. Regardless of how you feel about the annexation, you are a resident of Meadowbrook Estates, and you will comply with our standards. Barbara crossed her arms. This neighborhood has spent considerable time and money maintaining property values and aesthetic standards. We cannot have commercial farming equipment parked on residential streets, and we certainly cannot have residents who simply ignore their financial obligations. Those trucks were on my private driveway, on my own property, preparing to do the job they were purchased for. Your driveway is visible from the street, which makes it subject to our visibility standards, and commercial vehicles over a certain weight are prohibited from overnight parking in residential areas. I stared at her. You are insane. You know that, right? You are actually insane. I am going to have to ask you to leave, Mr. Peterson. If you continue to harass me, I will call the police. Harass you? You stole my trucks. The college kid at the desk was watching us with wide eyes. Barbara pointed at the door. Leave, now, or I make the call. I wanted to keep arguing, but I could see it was pointless. Barbara Hendricks was not going to be reasoned with. She had power, and she was enjoying using it. I turned and walked out, my hands shaking with anger. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Miguel and my insurance agent, Carol, trying to figure out what options I had left. Carol was a woman in her 60s who had been handling my crop insurance for the last decade. She had seen me through hail damage, drought, and equipment failures, but she looked grim as she reviewed my policy. The problem is that crop insurance does not cover losses due to inability to deliver, Carol explained. It covers weather damage, pest damage, disease, things like that. But if the crop itself is fine and you just cannot get it to market because of an HOA dispute, that is not a covered loss. Even though the crop will be damaged because of the delay, I asked. You would have to prove that the damage was directly caused by the delay and that the delay was beyond your control. And even then, it is going to be a fight with the insurance company. So basically, I am screwed, Carol sighed. I will do what I can, Lucas, but I am not going to lie to you. This is bad. After Carol left, Miguel and I sat in silence for a while. Finally, Miguel spoke up. What if we unload the trailers and store the wheat somewhere else, at least get it out of the heat? Where? We do not have storage capacity for that much grain. The silos are already full from the winter wheat harvest. What about tarps? We could spread it out in one of the empty barns. I shook my head. That would take days with the crew we have, and the quality would still degrade. Plus, the elevator would never accept it after it has been improperly stored. We would lose the premium, and they might reject it entirely. There has to be something we can do. There is. I am going to bury Barbara Hendricks and her entire HOA board in lawsuits until they wish they had never heard my name. But lawsuits take time, and time was the one thing I did not have. Over the next 3 days, I watched the weather forecast with growing dread. The storm system that was supposed to hit Thursday got delayed, which gave me a small reprieve, but the temperatures were climbing into the mid-90s. Wheat stored in sealed metal trailers sitting in the sun was cooking. Richard Chen filed an emergency motion with the Riley County District Court arguing that the impoundment violated Kansas agricultural exemption laws. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, 5 days away. I called the towing company every day, begging them to at least let me move the trailers into shade or run fans on them. Derek Simmons told me that any modification to the storage conditions would require written authorization from the HOA. I called Barbara Hendricks probably 20 times. She never picked up. I left messages that started out polite and got progressively more desperate and angry. She never called back. On Saturday, 4 days after the impoundment, I got a call from the grain elevator. Mr. Peterson, we have you down for delivery Monday morning, but we wanted to confirm. Are you going to make that slot? I do not know yet. I have a court hearing Monday about getting my trucks released. There was a pause. Lucas, I need to be straight with you. If that wheat has been sitting in closed trailers for a week in this heat, we are going to have to test it pretty thoroughly before we can accept it. Moisture levels, mold, insect activity, the whole deal. And if it does not meet our standards, we cannot take it. I know. I'm sorry. I wish there was more I could do. Sunday evening, I drove to the towing company lot. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence with barbed wire on top, and a big sign warned about video surveillance and guard dogs. I could see my trucks parked in the back corner, still hooked to their trailers. I sat in my pickup for an hour, just staring at them, thinking about everything my family had built and how it was all at risk because of some power-hungry HOA president and her make-believe kingdom. The court hearing Monday morning was held in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and coffee. Richard Chen presented our case to Judge Martha Connolly, a woman in her late 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He argued that Kansas law specifically exempted agricultural equipment from certain types of liens and seizures, especially when that equipment was essential to an ongoing farming operation. The HOA's lawyer, a slick guy in his 30s named Brad Winters, argued that the exemptions did not apply because the trucks were registered as personal vehicles, not commercial agricultural equipment, and that the HOA lien was properly filed and executed according to Kansas statute. Judge Connolly listened to both sides, asked a few pointed questions, and then sat back in her chair. "Here's my problem, Mr. Chen. While I sympathize with your client's situation, the law is pretty clear that HOA liens can attach to personal property, and vehicles are personal property. The agricultural exemption you are citing applies primarily to tools, machinery, and equipment that cannot be easily separated from the farming operation. Trucks, even commercial ones, do not clearly fall under that exemption. Your Honor, without those trucks, Mr. Peterson cannot deliver his harvest. That makes them essential to his farming operation. I understand that, but the legal standard is not about what is convenient or even what is economically necessary. It is about what is specifically protected by statute." Judge Connolly looked at me. "Mr. Peterson, I am going to deny the emergency injunction. However, I am ordering an expedited hearing on the validity of the HOA fines themselves. That hearing will be held 2 weeks from today. If the fines are found to be improperly assessed, the HOA will be required to refund your money and may be liable for damages. But for now, the impoundment stands." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Richard put a hand on my shoulder as we left the courtroom. "I am sorry, Lucas. We will keep fighting this. In 2 weeks, it will not matter. The crop will be worthless." By Tuesday, 6 days after the impoundment, the weather finally broke. Thunderstorms rolled through Riley County, dropping 3 inches of rain in 12 hours. The temperature dropped into the 70s, which should have been a relief, but all I could think about was what that moisture was doing to the wheat locked in those trailers. Wednesday morning, I drove to the towing company with a check for $8,473. It represented most of my liquid cash reserves, money I had been saving for equipment repairs and seed for the next planting season. But I did not have a choice anymore. I needed those trucks back, even if the crop inside was already ruined. Derek Simmons processed the payment and handed me the keys. "Pleasure doing business with you, Mr. Peterson." I did not trust myself to respond. I just took the keys and walked to my trucks. The smell hit me as soon as I opened the first trailer. Musty, sour, the unmistakable odor of mold and fermentation. I climbed up and looked inside. The wheat, which had been a beautiful golden color when we loaded it, was now discolored and clumped together. In several spots, I could see visible mold growth. The moisture from the rain had seeped in through the seals, and combined with the heat from the previous days, it had created perfect conditions for spoilage. I checked the other 2 trailers. They were the same, roughly 60,000 bushels of wheat, representing hundreds of hours of work and hundreds of thousands of dollars in value, reduced to moldy garbage that even livestock operations would be reluctant to buy. I called Miguel. "Get the crew together. We need to haul this wheat to the elevator for testing, but I already know what they are going to say." The grain elevator testing confirmed what I already knew. The wheat was grade 5, the lowest possible grade, with moisture content at 18% and significant mold contamination. It was not suitable for human consumption and barely suitable for animal feed. The elevator offered me $3 per bushel compared to the $7.50 I would have gotten for grade 1 wheat. I did the math in my truck on the way home. Instead of making about $450,000 on the harvest, I was going to make about $180,000. And that was before I factored in the $8,000 I had paid the HOA, the legal fees to Richard Chen, and the increased costs I was going to face because I had depleted my cash reserves. I was looking at losses of over $300,000. That was enough to bankrupt the farm. That evening, I sat down and wrote out everything that had happened. Every date, every conversation, every dollar lost. Then I called Richard Chen. "I want to sue the HOA for the full amount of damages," I said. $300,000 plus legal fees plus punitive damages if we can get them. Richard was quiet for a moment. "That is a significant lawsuit, Lucas. It is going to be expensive to pursue, and there is no guarantee we will win. What are my chances? Honestly, maybe 50-50. We can argue that the HOA's actions were unreasonable and caused foreseeable damages, but they are going to argue that you were responsible for paying your dues on time and that the impoundment was legal. A judge or jury might see it either way. I do not care. I want to fight this. Okay, I will draft the complaint. But Lucas, you need to be prepared for this to get ugly. HOAs have insurance and legal funds specifically for this kind of thing. They can drag it out for years. Let them try. The lawsuit was filed in Riley County District Court 3 weeks later. I sued the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, Barbara Hendricks personally, and the management company they contracted with. The complaint alleged wrongful seizure, negligent infliction of economic harm, and violation of Kansas agricultural protection statutes. The HOA's response was filed a month after that. They denied all allegations and filed a counterclaim against me for unpaid HOA dues, legal fees, and damage to the HOA's reputation. They were claiming I owed them an additional $12,000. The discovery phase of the lawsuit dragged on for months. Richard subpoenaed all of the HOA's records, including the certified letters they claimed to have sent me. It turned out that the letters had been sent to the wrong address, an error by the management company that the HOA had never bothered to verify. Richard argued that this meant the impoundment was invalid from the start because I had never received proper notice. The HOA's lawyer argued that it was my responsibility to keep my address updated with the HOA, which I had actually done, so that argument fell apart pretty quickly. But Brad Winters was good at what he did, and he kept finding procedural ways to delay the case. Meanwhile, the farm was struggling. I had to take out a loan to buy seed for the spring planting, and the interest rate was brutal because the bank saw me as a high risk after the previous year's losses. I cut expenses everywhere I could, delaying equipment maintenance and reducing staff hours. Miguel stayed on, but I had to let go of 2 seasonal workers who had been with me for years. The stress was eating me alive. I was not sleeping well, and I was losing weight. My friends told me I looked terrible. My doctor told me my blood pressure was through the roof, but I could not let it go. Every time I thought about Barbara Hendricks and her smug smile, I felt my anger spike. 10 months after filing the lawsuit, we finally got a trial date. It was set for late April, almost exactly a year after the impoundment. Richard warned me that trials were unpredictable and that I should consider settling if the HOA made a reasonable offer. The HOA offered to drop their counterclaim if I dropped my lawsuit. I told them to go to hell. The trial lasted 3 days. Richard presented the timeline of events, the evidence of improper notice, the testimony from the grain elevator about the crop damage, and expert testimony from an agricultural economist about the financial losses I had suffered. I testified about the impact on my farm and my family's legacy. The HOA's defense was that they had followed proper procedures, that I had been a negligent HOA member who ignored my obligations, and that any crop damage was my responsibility for not finding alternative transportation. They brought in their own expert who argued that I could have rented trucks or borrowed equipment from neighboring farms. Barbara Hendricks testified, and it was the first time I had seen her since the day in her office. She was calm and professional on the stand, insisting that the HOA had acted appropriately and that they had to enforce the rules equally for all residents. When Richard cross-examined her and asked if she understood that her actions had caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, she said, Mr. Peterson had multiple opportunities to avoid the situation by simply paying his dues on time. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the foreperson announced that they had found in my favor on the wrongful seizure claim. The HOA was ordered to pay me $320,000 in compensatory damages, but they had rejected the request for punitive damages, which meant I was only getting back what I had lost, not any additional penalty against the HOA. And the judgment did not include my legal fees, which had run up to about $40,000 over the course of the year. Still, it was a win. Richard shook my hand and told me we had done well. I looked across the courtroom at Barbara Hendricks, expecting to see some kind of reaction. She was whispering to Brad Winters, and her face was red, but she was not looking at me. The HOA filed an appeal, which was their right. Richard told me it would be another year before the appeal was heard and that they might try to negotiate a settlement in the meantime. I told him I would consider a reasonable offer. 2 months later, I got a call from a friend who served on the county commission. "Lucas, I thought you should know. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA is in serious financial trouble." "What do you mean?" "That judgment you got against them? They do not have the cash to pay it. Their insurance policy has a $200,000 cap on judgments, so they are on the hook for the rest out of pocket. And apparently, they have been running deficits for a couple of years due to some bad management decisions." I felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I wanted the HOA to suffer consequences for what they had done. On the other hand, if they went bankrupt, I might never see my money. What happens if they cannot pay? They will have to levy a special assessment on all the homeowners in the subdivision. Could be a couple $1,000s per household. People are not going to be happy about that. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing rumors around town. The Meadowbrook Estates residents were furious when they found out about the special assessment. Many of them had no idea about the lawsuit or the impoundment, and they were shocked to learn that their HOA president had made such a catastrophic decision. A petition started circulating to recall Barbara Hendricks and the entire HOA board. The recall election was held in June, almost 14 months after the original impoundment. Barbara Hendricks and all 4 board members were voted out by overwhelming margins. The new board president was a retired accountant named Helen Morris, who called me the day after the election. "Mr. Peterson, I wanted to reach out and apologize on behalf of the HOA for what happened to you. What Barbara did was inexcusable, and the previous board should have stopped her." "I appreciate that," I said, not quite sure where this was going. "The new board has reviewed the case, and we have decided not to pursue the appeal. We are going to pay the judgment as quickly as we can manage it. I want to get this resolved so we can all move forward." "That sounds good to me. There is one more thing. We are also going to amend the HOA covenants to include specific exemptions for agricultural operations. Your farm was here long before our subdivision, and it was wrong to try to force you to comply with residential standards that do not make sense for a working farm. I was not expecting that." "Thank you. That means a lot." The HOA paid the judgment in installments over 6 months. It was not as fast as I would have liked, but at least the money was coming. I used it to pay off the loans I had taken out, replace some aging equipment, and rebuild my cash reserves. The farm stabilized, and I started sleeping better at night. Barbara Hendricks moved out of Meadowbrook Estates about 3 months after losing the recall election. I heard she took a job in Topeka and wanted to get away from the neighborhood where everyone knew her as the HOA president who bankrupted the association. I did not feel sorry for her. The story did not end there, though. About a year after the trial, I got a call from the Riley County District Attorney's Office. An investigator named Sarah Kowalski wanted to talk to me about the Meadowbrook Estates HOA case. I met her at a coffee shop in Manhattan. Sarah was a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and a serious demeanor. She ordered a black coffee and got right to the point. "Mr. Peterson, I have been reviewing the financial records from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA as part of a broader investigation. Some things have come to light that I think you should be aware of." "What kind of things?" "The fines that were assessed against you, the ones that led to the impoundment of your vehicles. Those fines were never properly approved by the HOA board. Barbara Hendricks assessed them unilaterally and then backdated the paperwork to make it look like the board had voted on them." I stared at her. "You're saying she forged documents?" "That is what it looks like. We have email records showing that the other board members did not even know about most of those fines until after the impoundment happened. When they asked Barbara about it, she told them it was all handled and not to worry about it. So the whole thing was illegal from the start." "It appears that way. We are also looking into the HOA's finances more broadly. There are some irregularities that suggest Barbara may have been using HOA funds for personal expenses. We are talking about potential embezzlement charges." I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to testify about what happened, both for the criminal case and potentially for a civil forfeiture action to recover any funds Barbara stole from the HOA. Whatever you need, I am happy to help." The investigation took another 6 months. During that time, Sarah and her team uncovered evidence that Barbara Hendricks had stolen approximately $70,000 from the HOA over a 3-year period. She had been issuing checks to fake vendors and pocketing the money, inflating maintenance costs and keeping the difference, and using HOA credit cards for personal purchases. The fines she had assessed against me were part of an attempt to bring in additional revenue to cover her tracks. Barbara was arrested in November on charges of embezzlement, forgery, and fraud. The arrest made the local news, and I got calls from several reporters asking for interviews. I declined. I had said everything I needed to say in court. The criminal trial was held the following spring. I testified about the impoundment and the forged fine documentation. Other HOA members testified about financial irregularities and Barbara's refusal to provide transparent accounting. An FBI forensic accountant walked the jury through the trail of stolen money. Barbara's defense was that she had made some mistakes in bookkeeping, but had never intended to steal anything. The jury did not buy it. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, along with restitution of $70,000 to the HOA. After the sentencing, Helen Morris called me again. "Lucas, I wanted you to know that the restitution money is going to be used to repay the special assessment that our homeowners had to pay because of the judgment against you. It is not going to cover all of it, but it will help." "That seems fair," I said. "I also wanted to tell you that the new board has voted to waive all HOA dues for your property going forward. We recognize that your farm provides a valuable agricultural buffer for the subdivision, and we do not want there to be any future conflicts." "I appreciate that, Helen. Thank you." "No, thank you for not giving up. If you had not fought this, we never would have known what Barbara was doing. She might have stolen a lot more before anyone caught on." I hung up and walked out to the fields. It was late May, and the winter wheat was almost ready for harvest again. The plants were healthy and golden, swaying in the breeze. Miguel and the crew were running pre-harvest equipment checks, making sure everything was ready to go when the time came. I thought about my grandfather, who had cleared this land with a mule and a plow. I thought about my father, who had invested in the first combines and grain trucks. I thought about everything that had almost been lost because one person decided that her power and her rules were more important than someone else's livelihood. But the farm was still here. The wheat was growing, and I was not going to let anyone take that away again. The harvest that year was one of the best I had ever had. Perfect weather, high yields, excellent grain quality. I made enough money to fully rebuild my reserves and even expand my operation by leasing an additional 80 acres from a neighbor who was retiring. Miguel got a well-deserved raise, and I was able to hire back the seasonal workers I had let go. Life went back to normal, or as normal as farming ever gets. I still drove past the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision every day on my way to town. But now when I saw those houses, I did not feel anger anymore. I just felt tired. Tired of the whole thing, tired of the fighting, tired of the stress. But I also felt proud. Proud that I had stood up for myself and my farm. Proud that justice, however slow and imperfect, had eventually been served. And proud that the land my grandfather had homesteaded was going to continue as a working farm for at least one more generation. The criminal case against Barbara Hendricks made me think a lot about how HOAs operate and who oversees them. I started paying more attention to county commission meetings and learned that Kansas had some of the weakest HOA regulations in the country. Associations could assess fines, file liens, and foreclose on properties with minimal oversight and almost no accountability. I started talking to other people who had been abused by their HOAs. There were more of them than I expected. A retired veteran who had been fined $5,000 for displaying an American flag that was slightly too large, according to HOA standards. A single mother who had been threatened with foreclosure because she could not afford to repaint her house in an approved color within the HOA's demanded time frame. An elderly couple whose HOA had tried to force them to remove a wheelchair ramp because it was not aesthetically pleasing. Each story made me angrier. These were people who had worked hard, bought homes, and just wanted to live their lives. But they were being terrorized by petty tyrants who had been given just enough power to make other people miserable. I started attending county commission meetings and speaking during public comment periods. I argued that Kansas needed stronger HOA regulations, including mandatory external audits, term limits for board members, and easier processes for homeowners to challenge fines and violations. Some commissioners listened politely. Others clearly thought I was wasting their time, but I kept showing up. And slowly, other people started showing up too. The veteran with the flag issue, the single mother, the elderly couple, more and more homeowners who had been victimized by abusive HOAs. We formed a group called Kansas Homeowners for Fair Governance and started lobbying the state legislature for reform. It was slow work. HOAs had powerful allies in the real estate development industry, and those developers had money and lobbyists. But we had something more powerful, which was stories. Real stories from real people about real harm. 2 years after Barbara Hendricks was sent to prison, the Kansas legislature passed the Homeowner Association Accountability Act. It was not everything we wanted, but it was a start. The law required annual external audits for HOAs with more than 50 homes, capped fine amounts for minor violations, and created an expedited arbitration process for homeowners to challenge improper fines. The law also included a specific provision protecting agricultural operations from HOA restrictions, nicknamed the Peterson provision by some of the legislators who supported it. I testified at the committee hearing, and when the bill passed, several representatives asked to take photos with me. I felt awkward about the attention, but I was glad that something good had come from everything I had gone through. Back on the farm, life continued. I got older, and farming did not get any easier, but I had weathered the worst storm that could be thrown at me and come out the other side. Some of the younger farmers in the area started asking me for advice, and I found myself becoming something of a mentor. I told them about proper record keeping, about understanding their legal rights, about standing up for themselves when someone tried to push them around. Miguel eventually became my full partner in the operation. He had been with me through the darkest days, and I trusted him completely. We talked about what would happen when I retired, and we started making plans for him to buy out my share of the operation gradually. The Peterson farm would continue, even if it eventually had a different name on the mailbox. I never forgot what Barbara Hendricks did, but I stopped letting it consume me. Anger is like a fire. If you feed it, it grows and eventually burns you up from the inside. I had to let it go, not for her sake, but for mine. Sometimes I would see former Meadowbrook Estates board members around town. They usually avoided eye contact. Helen Morris always waved and said hello. She had turned out to be a good HOA president, running the association with transparency and common sense. Under her leadership, the subdivision had stabilized financially and become a decent place to live. 3 years after the criminal trial, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Barbara Hendricks. She was still in prison, but eligible for parole soon. The letter was short and handwritten. Mr. Peterson, I know you have no reason to forgive me or even read this letter. What I did to you was wrong. I let power go to my head, and I made decisions that hurt you and your livelihood. I am not asking for forgiveness because I do not deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I think about what I did every day, and I am sorry. I hope your farm has recovered and that you are doing well. Sincerely, Barbara Hendricks. I read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer. I did not know how to feel about it. Part of me wanted to believe that she was genuinely remorseful. Part of me thought it was just a ploy to help her parole case. In the end, it did not matter. What was done, and no apology could give me back the year of hell I had gone through. But I did not throw the letter away either. I kept it, maybe as a reminder that even people who do terrible things are still human, still capable of reflection and regret. Or maybe I just did not know what else to do with it. The farm continued to thrive. I expanded gradually, adding more acreage and diversifying into some specialty crops that commanded premium prices. The wheat remained the foundation of the operation, but we also started growing sunflowers and soybeans, and even tried some organic production methods that opened up new markets. The equipment I had almost lost to the HOA impoundment was still running strong. I kept those 3 white Ford F350s longer than I probably should have, even when newer, more efficient trucks became available. They were a reminder of what I had fought for and what I had won. Every harvest season, when those trucks rolled out of my driveway loaded with grain, I thought about that morning when the tow trucks came. I thought about the panic and the anger and the feeling of helplessness. And then I thought about everything that came after, the legal battles, the victories, the changes we had made to protect other homeowners from similar abuse. The farm that my grandfather started with a mule and a plow had survived depression, drought, floods, market crashes, and one very determined HOA president. It would continue to survive because that is what farms do. They endure, they adapt, they keep growing. I stood in my field one evening in late June, watching the sunset over rows of wheat that stretched to the horizon. The air smelled like earth and growing things and possibilities. Miguel drove up in his truck and got out, walking over to stand beside me. "Good crop this year," he said. "Best in a while," I agreed. "You ever regret fighting the HOA as hard as you did?" I thought about it. The stress, the legal fees, the lost sleep, the year of my life consumed by anger and litigation. "No," I said finally. "Some things are worth fighting for." Miguel nodded. We stood there in comfortable silence as the sun touched the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The wheat whispered in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song. This was home. This was everything my family had built, and everything I would pass on to the next generation. No HOA, no petty bureaucrat, no amount of fines or liens or impounded trucks could take that away. The land endured, and so did I. The next morning, I drove into town for coffee and ran into Brad Winters, the lawyer who had represented the HOA during the trial. We had not spoken since the verdict, and I expected him to avoid me. Instead, he walked over to my table. "Lucas, do you have a minute?" I gestured to the empty chair. "Sure." He sat down, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for how things went down. I was just doing my job representing the HOA, but looking back, I think I should have pushed Barbara harder to settle. What she did to you was not right. You were doing what your client asked. I do not hold that against you. I appreciate that. For what it is worth, I do not take HOA cases anymore. After everything came out about Barbara's embezzlement and the forged documents, I realized how easy it is for these associations to go off the rails. The people running them are just volunteers, but they wield a lot of power, and sometimes they abuse it. That is why we need better regulations." I agree. I actually testified in favor of the Accountability Act when it was being considered. I figured it was the least I could do. We talked for a few more minutes, and then he left. I sat there finishing my coffee and thinking about how strange life could be. The lawyer who had argued against me in court had become an advocate for HOA reform. The HOA that had tried to destroy my farm had been rebuilt under better leadership. And Barbara Hendricks, the person who started it all, was sitting in a prison cell thinking about her mistakes. None of it brought back the crop I lost or the year of stress and pain. But it was something. Change was slow and imperfect, but it was still change. I paid for my coffee and drove back to the farm. There was work to be done, as there always was. Fences to mend, equipment to maintain, crops to tend. The rhythm of farm life was constant and demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying. Every season brought challenges, and every season brought rewards. That afternoon, I was working on a fence line when I saw a car pull up my driveway. A young couple got out, looking around with expressions of wonder. I walked over to see what they needed. "Can I help you folks?" The young man extended his hand. "Mr. Peterson, I am David, and this is my wife, Jennifer. We are thinking about buying a house in Meadowbrook Estates, and the real estate agent mentioned that the subdivision is adjacent to your farm. We wanted to introduce ourselves." I shook his hand, then Jennifer's. "Nice to meet you. You're okay with living next to a working farm. It can get noisy during planting and harvest, and sometimes there are dust and smells." Jennifer laughed. "Are you kidding? That is part of the appeal. We grew up in cities, and we are tired of it. We want our kids to grow up seeing where food comes from and understanding agriculture. Well, you will definitely get that here." David looked around at the fields. "We heard about what happened with the old HOA board and everything you went through. The new board told us they have changed the rules to make sure farms like yours are protected. That is actually one of the reasons we are interested in the area. It shows that the community learned from its mistakes. I hope so. Helen Morris and the current board have done a good job turning things around. We talked for a while longer, and I ended up giving them a tour of the farm. They asked good questions and seemed genuinely interested in agriculture. When they left, Jennifer said, "We will probably put in an offer on that house. It will be nice to have neighbors like you." After they drove away, I stood there feeling something I had not felt in a long time when thinking about Meadowbrook Estates, which was optimism. Maybe the nightmare was really over. Maybe the subdivision and the farm could coexist peacefully. Maybe some good had come from all the pain. The years continued to pass. David and Jennifer did buy that house, and they became good friends. Their kids loved visiting the farm, and I let them help with small tasks during harvest. Other new families moved into Meadowbrook Estates, and most of them appreciated having a working farm as a neighbor rather than resenting it. Helen Morris served 2 terms as HOA president, then handed the role over to another reasonable person who continued her policies of transparency and common sense. The association remained financially stable, and there were no more stories of abusive fines or property seizures. I kept working with the Kansas Homeowners for Fair Governance group, and we continued to push for additional reforms. Some passed, some failed, but the conversation had changed. Legislators and regulators were paying more attention to HOA abuses, and homeowners had more resources to fight back when associations overstepped their authority. Barbara Hendricks was released on parole after serving 3 years of her sentence. I heard she moved out of state and was working in retail somewhere. I never saw her again, and I was fine with that. Some chapters in life need to stay closed. Miguel and I finalized the partnership agreement, and he bought his first 20% share of the farm. We planned for him to gradually increase his ownership until he controlled the majority, and I could retire. It felt right. Miguel had earned it through years of hard work and loyalty, and I knew he would take care of the land the way my family always had. I was in my early 60s now, and my body was starting to remind me that farming is hard physical work. My knees ached in the morning, and I could not work the long hours I used to manage. But I was still here, still farming, still tending the land that had sustained my family for 3 generations. One evening in early autumn, I was sitting on my porch when Helen Morris drove up. She got out carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I hope I am not intruding," she said, "but the board just finished a meeting and I wanted to share some news with you. Come on up. What's going on?" She poured the wine and handed me a glass. "The HOA just finished paying off the last of the debt from your judgment and the special assessment. We are finally in the black again, and our reserve fund is healthy. It took 5 years, but we made it." I raised my glass. "Congratulations. You did a hell of a job turning that association around." "We all did. But I wanted you to know because none of it would have happened if you had not stood up to Barbara. You could have just walked away, let the farm fail, and moved on. But you fought, and your fight exposed all the rot in the system. You saved a lot of people from future abuse. I was just trying to save my farm. Maybe. But you did a lot more than that." Helen clinked her glass against mine. "Thank you, Lucas." We sat there on the porch as the sun set, talking about the years that had passed and the lessons learned. It was peaceful, sitting there with someone who had once been part of an organization that tried to destroy me, but who had become a friend and an ally. After Helen left, I stayed on the porch as darkness fell. The fields were quiet now, the harvest complete for another year. The wheat had been delivered on time, graded premium, and sold at a good price. The trucks that had once been impounded were sitting in my equipment shed, ready for the next season. Everything was as it should be. I thought about the long, strange journey from that morning, when the tow trucks came to this moment of peace and stability. It had been painful and expensive and exhausting. But I had survived. The farm had survived, and maybe, just maybe, the system was a little bit better because of it. The stars came out, bright and clear in the Kansas sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The wind rustled through the empty fields, carrying the smell of earth and the promise of next year's planting. I finished my wine and went inside, ready for whatever came next. Because that is what farmers do. We endure, we adapt, we keep going. And no matter what challenges come our way, whether they are from the weather or the markets or power-hungry HOA presidents, we find a way to keep the land productive and the legacy alive. The story of the impounded trucks and the rotted crop became something of a legend in Riley County. People told it as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and as an inspiration for standing up to bullies. I got tired of telling it after a while, but I understood why people wanted to hear it. It had a clear villain, a sympathetic victim, and ultimately a satisfying resolution. But the real story, the one I lived through, was more complicated than the legend. It was about the grinding stress of financial uncertainty, the lonely fear of losing everything, the frustration of a legal system that moves too slowly to prevent harm even when it eventually delivers justice. It was about learning that sometimes doing the right thing costs everything you have, and then somehow finding the strength to pay that price anyway. I would not wish the experience on anyone, but I also would not trade it, because it taught me things about myself and about justice and about the importance of fighting for what matters. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. As I settled into bed that night, I thought about the young farmers I had been mentoring and the advice I always gave them. Keep good records, know your rights, do not let anyone push you around, and most importantly, remember that the land is not just a business asset or a piece of property. It is a living legacy, a responsibility passed down through generations, and something worth fighting for no matter what the cost. My grandfather would have understood, my father would have approved, and someday, when Miguel's children took over the farm, they would understand too. The land endures, and so do the people who tend it. That is the only story that really matters. I closed my eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of the farmhouse settling for the night. The creak of old wood, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind through the eaves. These were the sounds of home, of safety, of a battle won and a legacy preserved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be equipment to repair, weather to worry about, markets to navigate. But tonight, everything was quiet and peaceful and right. The farm was still here. I was still here. And that was enough.